February 24th, 1991. The operations room in the General Staff building on Frunzenskaya Embankment was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Outside, Moscow was locked in the grip of a brutal winter, but inside, 24 of the Soviet Union's most senior military officers sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the large screens displaying CNN's live coverage of Operation Desert Storm. General Mikhail Moiseyev, chief of the Soviet General Staff, sat in the front row, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the monitors. At 52, he was one of the youngest men ever to hold his position, a veteran of Afghanistan who had risen through the ranks during the final years of the Cold War. Now, as he watched American forces systematically dismantling the Iraqi military, an army trained, equipped, and organized according to Soviet doctrine, he felt something close to nausea. "Rewind that," he said quietly to the technician. "Show me the Apache attack again." The footage rolled back, then played forward. Night vision imagery, green and grainy, showing American AH-64 Apache helicopters engaging Iraqi positions. The Iraqis never saw them coming. Laser-guided Hellfire missiles streaked across the screen, and one by one, Iraqi tanks, Soviet-made T-72s, the pride of Soviet armor design, exploded in brilliant white flashes. 34 tanks destroyed in the first 90 seconds, said Colonel General Mahmoud Gharib, a military theorist and historian who had fought in World War II. His voice was hollow. They never even got a shot off. Behind them, younger officers muttered to each other in disbelief. Some took notes frantically, others simply stared, their faces pale. They were watching the future of warfare, and it looked nothing like what they had prepared for. General Valentin Varenikov, commander of Soviet ground forces, stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the screens. At 64, he was old-school Soviet military, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, a man who believed in mass mobilization, in the superiority of Soviet arms, in the inevitability of socialist victory. What he was seeing on those screens challenged everything he had built his career on. "This is propaganda," he said, not turning around. "American propaganda. They're exaggerating their success, making it look easier than it is. The Iraqis will counterattack. They have 1 million men under arms. They have—" "Valentin Ivanovich," Moiseyev interrupted gently. "We have our own intelligence, our satellites, our observers in Baghdad. This is not propaganda. This is what is actually happening." Varenikov turned, his face flushed. "Then the Iraqis are cowards. They're not fighting. A real army, a Soviet army, would never—" "A Soviet army would be destroyed just as quickly," said General Makashov, commander of the Volga-Urals military district. The room went silent. It was one thing to think it. It was another to say it aloud. Varenikov looked like he'd been slapped. "You don't know that. You can't." "Look at the screen," Makashov said, his voice hard. "The Iraqis are using our tactics, our equipment, our doctrine, everything we taught them, and they're being slaughtered, not defeated, slaughtered. There's a difference." On the screen, CNN was showing footage of the Highway of Death, the road from Kuwait to Basra, where retreating Iraqi forces had been caught in the open by American aircraft. The images were apocalyptic. Hundreds of vehicles burned and twisted, bodies scattered among the wreckage, the desert turned into a graveyard. "How many aircraft did they lose doing that?" asked General Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, commander of the Soviet Air Force. The intelligence officer, consulting his notes, answered, "In that particular attack? None, sir. The Americans have lost a total of 38 aircraft in the entire campaign. The Iraqis have lost over 300, plus their entire integrated air defense system." Shaposhnikov closed his eyes. He had spent his entire career in the Soviet Air Force, had helped design the doctrine that was supposed to give them air superiority over NATO in any European war. And now he was watching that doctrine, exported to Iraq, being torn apart by American technology and tactics he barely understood. Stealth aircraft, he said quietly. That's the key. Their F-111s took out the air defense network in the first hours. Without air defense, everything else collapses. We have nothing that can match stealth, said his deputy, General Danikin. Nothing even close. Our best radars can't see them. Our missiles can't hit them. They can strike anywhere, anytime, and we can't stop them. Moiseyev stood and walked to the front of the room facing his officers. He looked exhausted, and not just from the late hour. For the past 3 days since the ground war had begun, he had barely slept. He had been compiling reports, analyzing data, trying to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Comrades, he said, we need to face reality. What we are watching is not just the defeat of Iraq. It is the obsolescence of Soviet military doctrine. Everything we have prepared for, everything we have trained for, is being proven wrong in real time. That's defeatist talk, Varenikov said angrily. We are the Soviet Army. We defeated Nazi Germany. We defeated Nazi Germany with mass mobilization and massive casualties, Moiseyev interrupted. 27 million dead. We won through sheer numbers and willingness to sacrifice. But this, he gestured at the screens, this is a different kind of war. Precision weapons, stealth technology, real-time intelligence, network-centric warfare. We have none of these things. He paused, letting his words sink in. The Americans are fighting a 21st century war. We are still prepared to fight a 20th century war, and if we ever faced them in actual combat, we would lose. Badly. The meeting broke up near midnight, but Moiseyev asked several senior officers to remain. Gariv, Shaposhnikov, and General Vladimir Lobov, First Deputy Chief of the General Staff. They moved to a smaller conference room, away from the junior officers and the ever-present political officers who reported to the Communist Party. Moiseyev poured vodka into 5 glasses and passed them around. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. How did this happen? Shaposhnikov asked finally. How did they get so far ahead of us? Gariv, the military historian, answered. It's been building for 20 years. After Vietnam, the Americans completely reformed their military. They studied their failures. They developed new doctrine. They invested in technology, precision weapons, stealth, satellites, computers. Meanwhile, he trailed off, shaking his head. Meanwhile, we stagnated, Lobov finished. We kept building the same tanks, the same aircraft, the same doctrine. We assumed that what worked in 1945 would work forever. We were wrong. It's not just technology, Moiseyev said. Did you see how they operated? The coordination between air and ground forces, the speed of decision-making, the initiative given to junior officers. That's not just equipment, that's culture. That's a different way of thinking about warfare. He pulled out a folder and opened it. I've been reading American military journals. After Vietnam, they developed something called air-land battle doctrine. The idea is to use deep strikes and maneuver warfare to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, not just to occupy territory. They integrate all their forces, air, ground, naval, space-based assets, into a single system. We have integrated operations, Varenikov protested. We have coordination, Moiseyev corrected. That's different. The Americans have real integration. Every soldier, every tank, every aircraft is networked together. They share information in real time. A pilot can see what a ground commander sees. A tank crew can call in air support and have it arrive in minutes. That's not coordination. That's a system. Shaposhnikov nodded slowly. And we have nothing like it. Our communications are decades behind. Our computers are primitive. Our doctrine still assumes that we'll fight the way we fought in World War II. Mass formations, breakthrough operations, exploitation. Which is exactly what the Iraqis tried to do, Gariv said. They massed their forces in Kuwait. They dug in. They prepared for a frontal assault. And the Americans simply went around them, cut them off, and destroyed them piecemeal. Lobov poured himself another vodka. So what do we do? How do we close this gap? The room fell silent, because they all knew the answer, and it was terrifying. We can't, Moiseyev said finally. Not with our current economy, not with our current technology base. The Americans spend 3 times what we spend on defense, and their economy is 4 times larger. They can afford to develop stealth aircraft and precision weapons and satellite networks. We can barely afford to maintain what we have. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Moscow night. The Soviet Union is collapsing, comrades. We all know it. The economy is in free fall. The republics are demanding independence. The Communist Party is losing control. And our military, the great Soviet army that defeated Hitler, is obsolete. So we just surrender, Vorenikov said bitterly. We just accept American hegemony. We accept reality, Moiseyev said. And reality is that we cannot compete militarily with the United States. Not now, maybe not ever. Across Moscow, in a nondescript building near Lubyanka Square, another group of Soviet officers was watching the same footage. But these were not General Staff officers. These were GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and their analysis was even more pessimistic. Colonel General Yevgeny Timokhin, head of GRU, sat with his senior analysts reviewing classified reports from Soviet observers in Iraq. Unlike the sanitized CNN footage, these reports included detailed assessments of Iraqi casualties, equipment losses, and the complete breakdown of command and control. The Republican Guard divisions have ceased to exist as fighting formations, one analyst reported. The Tawakalna division, their best unit, was destroyed in less than 6 hours. The Americans lost 12 men. The Iraqis lost an estimated 3,000, with another 5,000 captured. 6 hours, Timokhin repeated. The Tawakalna division was equipped with our best export equipment, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, SA-6 air defense systems, and it was destroyed in 6 hours. Not destroyed, the analyst corrected. Annihilated. There's a difference. Destroyed means they fought and lost. Annihilated means they barely had a chance to fight. Another analyst spoke up. Sir, we need to talk about the implications for our own forces. The Americans demonstrated capabilities we didn't know they had. Their intelligence was perfect. They knew where every Iraqi unit was, down to individual battalions. Their precision weapons hit targets with meter-level accuracy. Their stealth aircraft operated with impunity. And their logistics, added another. They moved 500,000 troops and all their equipment halfway around the world in 6 months. Then they sustained them in combat operations with no supply problems. We can barely sustain operations in Afghanistan, which shares a border with us. Timokhin nodded grimly. He had been arguing for years that the Soviet military was falling behind, but no one wanted to listen. The political leadership wanted to hear that the Soviet army was invincible. The General Staff wanted to believe that Soviet doctrine was superior, and the defense industry wanted to keep building the same equipment they had been building for decades. I'm preparing a report for the president, Timokhin said. I'm going to tell him that if we ever fought a conventional war with NATO, we would lose, decisively. The only thing that keeps us safe is our nuclear arsenal. You'll be accused of defeatism, one of his deputies warned. I'll be accused of telling the truth, Timokhin corrected. And right now, that's more important than my career. On February 28, 1991, 100 hours after the ground war began, President George H.W. Bush ordered a ceasefire. The Iraqi army had been routed. Kuwait had been liberated. The war was over. In Moscow, the Soviet military leadership gathered one final time to assess what had happened. The mood was funereal. Moiseyev presented his conclusions to a small group that included Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov and several members of the Politburo. His report was blunt to the point of being brutal. The Gulf War has demonstrated that Soviet military doctrine is obsolete, he began. Our equipment, our tactics, our training, our organization, all of it is a generation behind the Americans. If we faced NATO in a conventional war, we would lose. Yazov, a hardliner who had opposed Gorbachev's reforms, bristled. That's unacceptable. We need to modernize, to do what? Moiseyev interrupted. To spend money we don't have on technology we can't develop. Comrade Minister, our economy is collapsing. We can't even pay our soldiers on time. How are we going to develop stealth aircraft and precision weapons? He clicked through to the next slide, showing comparative defense spending. The Americans spend $300 billion per year on defense. We spend about $300 billion per year on defense. We spend about $300 billion per year on defense. We spend about $150 billion, and most of that goes to maintaining our nuclear forces and paying personnel. We have nothing left for modernization. Then we need to increase defense spending, said one of the Politburo members. With what? Moiseyev asked. We're running out of hard currency. Our factories are outdated. Our technology base is decades behind. Even if we had unlimited money, we couldn't catch up. The Americans have too much of a lead. General Guriev spoke up. There's another factor we need to consider. The Gulf War wasn't just a military victory for the Americans, it was a political victory. They assembled a coalition of 30 countries. They got UN approval. They had Arab states fighting alongside them against another Arab state. That's unprecedented. And it means, Moiseyev added, that the Americans have won the ideological war. Countries want to align with them, not with us. Our model, the Soviet model, is seen as a failure. And after what the world just watched in Iraq, our military model is seen as a failure too. The room was silent. These were truths that no one wanted to speak aloud, but they could no longer be denied. Finally, Yazov spoke. So what do you recommend? Moiseyev took a deep breath. I recommend that we fundamentally rethink our defense posture. We cannot compete with the Americans in conventional forces. We need to accept that. Our security will have to depend on our nuclear deterrent and on diplomacy, not on the ability to win a conventional war. That's surrender, Varenikov said bitterly. That's reality, Moiseyev replied. And if we don't accept it, we'll bankrupt ourselves trying to compete in an arms race we can't win. In the weeks and months that followed, the implications of the Gulf War rippled through the Soviet military establishment. Officers who had spent their careers preparing to fight NATO realized that their plans were worthless. Defense industries that had built thousands of tanks and aircraft realized that their products were obsolete. Military academies that had taught Soviet doctrine for decades realized they needed to completely revise their curriculum. But there was no money for reform. The Soviet economy was in its final death spiral. In August 1991, just 6 months after the Gulf War ended, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, partly motivated by fear that he was letting the Soviet Union and its military collapse. The coup failed, but it accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent. By December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The military that had watched the Americans destroy Iraq found itself without a country. The officers who had gathered in that operations room to watch CNN scattered to different republics, different careers, different lives. Some, like Moiseyev, tried to reform the Russian military that emerged from the Soviet collapse. But without money, without technology, without the political will to make hard choices, their efforts largely failed. The Russian military of the 1990s became a shadow of the Soviet military, underfunded, demoralized, corrupt. Others, like Varenikov, never accepted what they had seen. They continued to believe that Soviet doctrine was sound, that Soviet equipment was adequate, that the Gulf War was an aberration. They blamed the Iraqis for poor performance, blamed Gorbachev for betraying the military, blamed everyone except themselves for the obsolescence they had witnessed. But a few younger officers, colonels and majors who had watched the Gulf War carefully, began to think differently. They studied American doctrine. They analyzed what had worked and what hadn't. They began to develop new ideas about how to fight a modern war, even with limited resources. One of those officers was a young colonel named Valery Gerasimov, who would eventually become chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. Another was Vladimir Putin, a KGB officer who watched the Gulf War and drew his own conclusions about American power and Russian weakness. Years later, when asked about the Gulf War, Moiseyev would say, "We knew we were behind the Americans, but we didn't know how far behind until we watched them destroy an army, trained and equipped exactly like ours. It was like watching our own funeral." Gariv, the military historian, would write, "The Gulf War marked the end of the Soviet military era. Everything we had built since 1945, our doctrine, our equipment, our way of thinking about war, was proven obsolete in 100 hours. We had been preparing to fight World War II again. The Americans had moved on to a completely different kind of warfare." And Shaposhnikov, who would briefly serve as the last defense minister of the Soviet Union, would reflect, "The tragedy was not that we lost the Cold War. The tragedy was that we lost it and didn't realize it until we watched the Americans destroy Iraq. By then, it was too late to do anything about it." What Soviet commanders said when they watched the US destroy the Iraqi Army in 100 hours was, in essence, this: "We are finished." Not defeated in battle, they never fought that battle, but rendered obsolete by technology, doctrine, and economics they could not match. They said it in different ways, some with anger, some with resignation, some with denial. But they all understood the fundamental truth. The Soviet military, which had defeated Nazi Germany and held the line against NATO for 45 years, could not compete with the American military of 1991. And that realization, more than any political decision, more than any economic crisis, marked the true end of the Soviet Union as a superpower. Because a nation that cannot defend itself, that cannot project power, that cannot compete militarily with its rivals, is not a superpower. It is just another country, struggling to survive in a world that has passed it by. The Gulf War didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it revealed that collapse to the Soviet military leadership in a way that could not be denied or ignored. And in the operations room on Frunzenskaya embankment, watching American forces systematically dismantle an army that looked exactly like theirs, Soviet commanders saw their own future, and it terrified them.